The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched his pilots prepare for what would become the most decisive naval battle of the Second World War. It was June 4, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had sailed into the Central Pacific with absolute confidence, carrying the momentum of 6 months of unbroken victories. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same pilot who had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, stood beside his Nakajima bomber, feeling the familiar weight of destiny upon his shoulders. The Pearl Harbor strike had been flawless, catching the American Pacific Fleet completely off guard and sinking or damaging 18 warships in a single morning. Now, as he gazed across the vast expanse of ocean toward Midway Atoll, Fuchida believed they were about to deliver the final blow that would drive America from the Pacific forever. The Japanese strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, had conceived Operation MI as the ultimate trap. By threatening Midway, a tiny coral atoll that served as America's westernmost Pacific outpost, the Japanese would force Admiral Chester Nimitz to commit his remaining carriers to a battle where they would be outnumbered and outgunned. Yamamoto's fleet was a floating city of destruction. 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the heart of the striking force, carrying 272 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots. These were the same carriers that had terrorized the Pacific for months, their planes having bombed Darwin, Ceylon, and countless Allied positions across the vast ocean theater. Supporting this aerial armada was a battle fleet that represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power. The massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, sailed with their escorts in a separate force, ready to engage any American surface ships that dared to challenge Japanese supremacy. Cruisers, destroyers, and submarines spread across hundreds of miles of ocean, creating a web of steel that seemed impossible to penetrate. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese had every reason for confidence as they approached Midway that fateful morning. The Japanese pilots who manned the aircraft that morning were not merely sailors. They were the elite of naval aviation, veterans of the China conflict and the early Pacific campaigns. They had perfected their craft through years of intensive training and months of combat experience. Their Zero fighters were still superior to most American aircraft, and their torpedo and dive bombers had proven devastatingly effective against Allied shipping. Below decks, the ship's crews worked with mechanical precision, a testament to years of rigorous training and an unshakable belief in Japanese naval supremacy. The engine rooms hummed with power, propelling the great carriers through the swells at 24 knots. In the ready rooms, intelligence officers briefed pilots on their targets: the airfield, the fuel tanks, the defensive positions that would need to be eliminated before the invasion force could land. Admiral Nagumo, veteran of countless naval campaigns, stood on Akagi's bridge with the satisfaction of a commander who had never known defeat. His carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, ravaged the Dutch East Indies, and driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean. The Americans, he believed, were demoralized and scattered, their Pacific fleet a shadow of its former strength. This battle would be the culmination of Japanese naval strategy, the decisive victory that would secure the Pacific for the Emperor and force America to seek a negotiated peace. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, and ahead lay Midway Atoll, tiny, distant, seemingly insignificant. None aboard the Japanese fleet could imagine that in the next few hours, the course of the Pacific War would be irrevocably altered, and Japan's naval supremacy would begin its catastrophic collapse in these very waters. Unknown to Admiral Nagumo and his confident fleet, America's greatest weapon in the Pacific was not a battleship or bomber, but a small team of cryptographers working in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had achieved what many thought impossible. They had cracked the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence. For weeks, Rochefort's team had worked around the clock, piecing together fragments of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. The code was fiendishly complex, but gradually, patterns emerged. References to AF appeared repeatedly in Japanese messages, and Rochefort became convinced that AF was the Japanese designation for Midway. To confirm this crucial intelligence, he devised a brilliant deception. Rochefort had Midway's garrison send an uncoded radio message reporting that their water purification system had broken down. Within hours, Japanese radio intercepts reported that AF was experiencing water shortages. The trap had worked perfectly. American intelligence now knew beyond doubt that Midway was the target, and more importantly, they knew when the attack would come. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced an agonizing decision. His intelligence told him exactly where and when the Japanese would strike, but his forces were desperately outnumbered. The Japanese were bringing 4 heavy carriers with experienced crews and superior aircraft. Nimitz could muster only 3 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet from Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown from Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Yorktown presented a particular challenge. The carrier had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier, and naval architects estimated that repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz didn't have 3 months. He had 3 days. In a feat of industrial miracle working, Pearl Harbor's shipyard crews worked continuously for 72 hours, welding steel plates, rewiring damaged systems, and patching hull breaches. When Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th, she carried some of the repair crews with her, still working as the ship headed toward what would become the most important naval battle in American history. The American plan was as desperate as it was audacious. Rather than waiting for the Japanese attack on Midway, Nimitz would position his carriers northeast of the atoll, hoping to catch the Japanese fleet by surprise, while their aircraft were committed to the attack on the island's installations. It was a calculated risk that required perfect timing and no small amount of luck. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, thrust into command of Task Force 16 when Admiral William Halsey fell ill with dermatitis, was an unlikely hero for such a crucial moment. A quiet, methodical officer known more for his strategic mind than his flamboyant leadership style, Spruance would prove to be exactly the right commander for the most critical naval battle of the war. As the American task forces moved into position, northeast of Midway, the island's defenders prepared for the assault they knew was coming. Marine Aircraft Group 22, commanded by Major Floyd Parks, had assembled a motley collection of aircraft: obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, ancient Vought Vindicator dive bombers, and a handful of newer Grumman Wildcat fighters. The sea pilots were mostly inexperienced, many having never seen combat, but they were determined to sell their lives dearly. The island's ground defenses were equally improvised but resolute. Colonel Harold Shannon's 6th Marine Defense Battalion had transformed the tiny atoll into a fortress, with anti-aircraft guns, coastal artillery, and machine gun positions covering every possible landing beach. They knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew that every minute they could delay the Japanese assault might give the American carriers time to strike. On the morning of June 4th, as the Japanese fleet approached from the northwest and the American carriers maneuvered unseen to the northeast, the stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese came with overwhelming force and absolute confidence, but the Americans came with something perhaps more valuable: advanced knowledge of enemy plans and the desperate courage of men fighting with their backs to the wall. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the first aircraft engines roared to life aboard the Japanese carriers. 108 bombers and fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, lifted off from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their destination, the military installations of Midway Atoll, 500 miles to the southeast. The attack formation flew through the pre-dawn darkness with mechanical precision, a testament to the skill and experience that had made Japanese naval aviation the most feared force in the Pacific. As Tominaga's bombers approached Midway, radar operators on the atoll detected the incoming formation at a distance of 93 miles. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as every available aircraft scrambled to meet the threat. Major Floyd Parks led his Marine fighters into the sky, knowing they were flying obsolete aircraft against the world's finest naval aviators, but determined to make the Japanese pay for every foot of American territory. The aerial battle that followed was brief and devastating. The Marine Brewster Buffalo fighters, already obsolete when the war began, were no match for the nimble Zero fighters escorting the Japanese bombers. Within minutes, 15 of the 25 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots becoming casualties of America's unpreparedness for modern aerial warfare. The surviving aircraft limped back to Midway's airfield, many too damaged to fly again. Despite the heroic sacrifice of the Marine aviators, Tomonaga's bombers reached their targets and delivered a punishing attack on Midway's installations. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel tanks exploded in towering pillars of black smoke, and the airfield's runways were cratered by high-explosive bombs. Yet as Tomonaga circled over the burning island, he realized that the attack had not been decisive. Many of the installations remained operational. Anti-aircraft fire continued to rise from multiple positions, and it was clear that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway completely. At 7 o'clock, Tomonaga transmitted the message that would seal the fate of the Japanese fleet. There is need for a second attack wave. This single transmission would trigger a series of decisions aboard Admiral Nagumo's flagship that would transform certain victory into catastrophic defeat. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a commander's nightmare. He had kept half his aircraft in reserve, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against any American naval forces that might appear. But Tomonaga's request for a second strike on Midway meant those aircraft would need to be rearmed, with high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking land targets. The process of changing armament was complex and time-consuming, requiring the aircraft to be struck below to the hangar decks where ordnance crews could replace torpedoes with bombs and armor-piercing projectiles with high-explosive ones. 7:15. Nagumo made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft for a second strike against Midway. Across the four carriers, hundreds of crew members began the laborious process of changing armament, stacking the removed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs on hangar decks, already crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition. The carriers, which had been poised for immediate action against any American naval threat, became floating ammunition depots where a single spark could trigger catastrophic explosions. As referenced in Gordon Pranga's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, the rearming process would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in naval history. 35 minutes later, at 7:50, a Japanese scout plane finally reported what Nagumo had dreaded. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. The message was incomplete and confusing. The pilot had not specified whether the American force included carriers, but it changed everything. If American carriers were present, Nagumo's aircraft needed to be armed with anti-ship weapons, not land attack bombs. The Japanese admiral now faced an impossible choice. His first attack wave was returning from Midway, running low on fuel and needing to land immediately. His hangar decks were cluttered with aircraft in various stages of rearming, and changing armament again would take precious hours. Meanwhile, American forces of unknown composition were approaching from the northeast, potentially within striking range of his fleet. Nagumo chose to recover his returning aircraft first, then complete the rearming process before launching a coordinated attack against the American ships. It was a reasonable decision based on sound naval doctrine, but it required time that Admiral Spruance was not willing to give him. Unknown to the Japanese commander, American carrier aircraft were already airborne and racing toward his fleet, guided by scout plane reports that had pinpointed the location of the Japanese carriers with deadly accuracy. At 7:35 on the morning of June 4th, the klaxon aboard USS Enterprise shrieked across the flight deck as Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance made the most crucial decision of his naval career. Despite being at the extreme range of his aircraft and knowing that many of his planes might not have enough fuel to return, Spruance ordered an immediate launch against the Japanese fleet. "Launch the attack," he commanded, and with those 3 words, committed the American carriers to a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 off Enterprise's deck, followed by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers and Lieutenant James Gray's fighters. From Hornet, came Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8, while Lieutenant Commander Ring led the dive bombers and Lieutenant Commander Mitchell the fighters. The American formation was a mixture of obsolete and modern aircraft, flown by pilots with varying degrees of experience, but united by a desperate determination to strike the first blow against the Japanese fleet. The flight to the target area became a navigation nightmare that would have tragic consequences. The various squadrons became separated in the morning haze, each following slightly different courses toward the reported position of the Japanese carriers. Some groups would find their targets, others would fly over empty ocean, running low on fuel before finally turning back toward their carriers. The lack of proper fighter escort for the torpedo bombers would prove catastrophic. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, was a half-Sioux Indian from South Dakota who had developed an almost mystical ability to navigate across the trackless Pacific. While other squadrons followed compass headings, Waldron flew by instinct, somehow sensing the location of the Japanese fleet. At 9:20, he spotted smoke on the horizon and knew he had found his target. What he saw filled him with both exhilaration and dread. The 4 Japanese carriers were arranged in a rough diamond formation, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers, whose anti-aircraft guns were already tracking the approaching American aircraft. Above the fleet, dozens of Zero fighters circled like sharks waiting for the attack they knew was coming. Waldron's 15 Devastator torpedo bombers were obsolete aircraft, too slow and too lightly armed to survive against modern fighters, but they represented America's best hope of striking back at the fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Attack. Immediately, Waldron transmitted to his squadron and led his aircraft into the most one-sided aerial battle of the Pacific War. The Zeros fell upon the American torpedo bombers like wolves among sheep. The Devastators, loaded with heavy torpedoes and flying barely above the wavetops, could not climb or turn quickly enough to evade the nimble Japanese fighters. One by one, Waldron's aircraft were shot down, their crews becoming casualties of America's technological inferiority and tactical desperation. Ensign George Gay, piloting the last surviving aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8, pressed his attack run toward the carrier Kaga, despite the overwhelming odds. Zero fighters swarmed around his aircraft, their cannon shells and machine gun bullets tearing through the Devastator's aluminum skin. His gunner, Robert Huntington, slumped forward in his seat, mortally wounded. But Gay continued his approach, determined to deliver his torpedo even if it cost his life. At the last moment, Gay released his torpedo and pulled up sharply, trying to escape over the Japanese fleet. A Zero fighter caught him as he climbed, cannon shells smashing through his engine and control surfaces. The Devastator crashed into the ocean just beyond the Japanese formation. Gay thrown clear but injured. Huntington killed on impact. Of the 15 aircraft and 30 aircrew of Torpedo Squadron 8, only Gay survived, floating in the water amid the wreckage of his squadron and watching the continuing battle with the unique perspective of a man who had looked death in the face and somehow lived to tell about it. As documented in Walter Lord's classic Incredible Victory, the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was repeated across the morning sky, as other American torpedo squadrons met similar fates. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered almost as heavily, with 10 of 14 aircraft shot down by the swarming Zero fighters. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, the squadron commander, was among the casualties, his aircraft crashing into the sea after releasing its torpedo in a futile attack against the carrier Akagi. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown met the same fate, losing 10 of 12 aircraft to the devastating Japanese fighter defense. By 10:24, the American torpedo attack was over, and it had been a complete disaster. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that had attacked the Japanese fleet, only 6 survived to return to their carriers. Not a single torpedo had found its target, and the cream of American naval aviation lay dead in the waters around the Japanese fleet. Admiral Nagumo had every reason to believe that the American attack had been defeated and that his carriers were secure. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had accomplished something their crews never lived to see. They had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the sky above the fleet dangerously exposed to attack from a different direction. At exactly 10:26 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet spread below him like toys on a blue carpet. Flying at 14,000 feet with 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, McCluskey had been searching for the enemy carriers for over an hour, following a Japanese destroyer that was racing northwest toward the main fleet. Below him, the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were arranged in their screening formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The timing was perfect through pure chance. The sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons had drawn every Japanese fighter down to sea level, where they were still circling and looking for survivors from the devastating attacks they had just repelled. The sky above the Japanese fleet was empty of defenders, leaving the carriers naked and vulnerable to attack from above. McCluskey wasted no time. Splitting his formation, he assigned his own squadron to attack the carrier Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron dove on Akagi. As the American dive bombers pushed over into their 70-degree dives, their crews could see the controlled chaos on the carrier's flight decks below. Aircraft spotted for takeoff, fuel lines snaking across the deck, ordnance crews still in the process of arming planes for the strike against the American fleet that would never come. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:26 and 20 seconds, crashing through the flight deck near the island and exploding among the aircraft parked on the hangar deck below. The second bomb hit moments later, detonating in the midst of fueled and armed aircraft, turning the carrier's interior into an inferno. Within minutes, secondary explosions were ripping through the ship as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked, off in a chain reaction of destruction. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Dick Best led his 3-plane section against Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier just aft of the midships elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft and ordnance stored in the hangar. The explosion set off a series of secondary blasts as the rearmed aircraft, their fuel tanks full and their bomb bays loaded, became giant firebombs that turned Akagi into a floating crematorium. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to the deck of his flagship's bridge by the force of the explosion, struggled to his feet and stared in disbelief at the destruction around him. The bridge windows were shattered, the ship's communications were cut, and below him, Akagi was being consumed by fires that the damage control parties could not hope to contain. The flagship of the Japanese fleet, veteran of Pearl Harbor and a dozen other victories, was dying beneath his feet. At almost the same moment, 17 Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, found the carrier Soryu steaming 10 miles away. Leslie's aircraft had been delayed by mechanical problems, but their late arrival proved fortuitous. They caught Soryu with 36 aircraft on her flight deck, all fueled and armed for the attack on the American fleet. 3 direct hits turned the carrier into a mass of flames, her aviation fuel feeding fires that made damage control impossible. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were mortally wounded. The carefully coordinated Japanese attack plan, months in the making, had been shattered by a handful of American dive bombers arriving at precisely the right moment and finding the enemy fleet at its most vulnerable. The transformation was so sudden and complete that many participants could barely comprehend what had happened. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, lay wounded in Akagi's sickbay as his ship burned around him. The aircraft he had expected to lead against the American fleet were twisted wreckage scattered across the hangar deck, their ordnance, adding fuel to the fires that were consuming the carrier from within. As referenced in Mitsuo Fuchida's own account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the speed and completeness of the disaster left the Japanese leadership stunned and unable to respond effectively. Captain Taijiro Aoki of Kaga found his ship transformed from a mighty aircraft carrier into a helpless hulk in a matter of minutes. The flight deck was buckled and burning, the hangar deck was an inferno, and the ship's machinery spaces were filling with smoke and superheated gases. Despite heroic efforts by the damage control parties, it was clear that Kaga was doomed. The order to abandon ship would come within hours, and one of Japan's most powerful carriers would slip beneath the waves, taking with her hundreds of highly trained aircrew and irreplaceable aircraft. The Japanese had approached Midway with 4 fleet carriers and the finest naval aviators in the world. In 5 minutes, they had lost 3 carriers and hundreds of their most experienced pilots. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted dramatically, but the battle was far from over. Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, still had the capability to launch a counterstrike, and Admiral Yamaguchi was already preparing his aircraft for a desperate attempt to salvage victory from the jaws of disaster. But even as Hiryu's pilots prepared for their revenge attack, the fundamental equation of the Pacific War had changed forever. Japan's advantage in carriers and experienced aircrew had been shattered in those 5 crucial minutes when American dive bombers found their targets undefended and struck with devastating effectiveness. As smoke billowed from the 3 burning Japanese carriers, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu faced the most desperate situation any naval commander could imagine. His ship was the sole survivor of the Kido Butai, the once invincible carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. Around him, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were blazing wrecks, their flight decks twisted by explosions and their hangar spaces consumed by uncontrollable fires. Yet Yamaguchi, known throughout the Japanese Navy for his aggressive spirit and tactical brilliance, was not ready to concede defeat. At 11:15, Yamaguchi launched 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet, determined to inflict maximum damage on the enemy carriers before his own ship met its inevitable fate. Leading the attack was Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, one of Japan's finest dive bomber pilots, who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and numerous other successful operations. The formation flew northeast toward the reported position of the American carriers, carrying the hopes of the entire Japanese fleet. The American carriers, meanwhile, were struggling with their own challenges. Yorktown had been operating with a skeleton crew of repair workers still aboard, and her hastily patched hull was already showing signs of strain. Enterprise and Hornet were recovering their returning dive bombers, many of which were critically low on fuel after the long flight to attack the Japanese fleet. The celebration of their spectacular success was tempered by the knowledge that Japanese counterattack was certain to come. At 12:10, radar operators aboard Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese formation at a distance of 46 miles. Admiral Fletcher immediately ordered his combat air patrol to intercept, but the 12 Wildcat fighters that rose to meet the attack were outnumbered and could not prevent all the Japanese aircraft from reaching their target. Kobayashi's dive bombers pushed through the fighter screen and attacked Yorktown with the same precision and determination that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the war. 3 bombs struck the American carrier in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the rag storage compartment, starting fires that spread rapidly through the ship's interior spaces. The second bomb destroyed Yorktown's radar and communications equipment, leaving the carrier blind and unable to coordinate her defenses. The third bomb struck near the smokestack, disrupting the ship's ventilation system and filling the lower decks with choking smoke. Yet Yorktown's damage control parties performed miracles of seamanship and courage. Within an hour, the fires were under control, the flight deck was patched with steel plates, and the carrier was making 20 knots and preparing to recover aircraft. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots observing from a distance, it appeared that they had attacked and damaged one American carrier, unaware that the new carrier they were seeing was actually Yorktown, repaired and operational again. This intelligence failure led to a second Japanese attack at 2:45, when Lieutenant Junior Grade Toshio Hashimoto led 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters against what the Japanese believed was a fresh American carrier. The attack was devastating. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding multiple compartments and causing the ship to list severely. This time, the damage was too extensive for repair, and Admiral Fletcher was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser as Yorktown's crew prepared to abandon ship. But Yamaguchi's attacks, while successful, had expended the last of Hiryu's striking power. The carrier had only a handful of aircraft remaining, and many of her most experienced pilots had not returned from their missions against the American fleet. As the afternoon wore on, American search planes located the final Japanese carrier, and Admiral Spruance prepared to deliver the coup de grace. At 4:30, 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found Hiryu steaming. Alone, her escort vessels scattered and her flight deck nearly empty. The attack was swift and merciless. 4 direct hits turned the carrier into a blazing wreck, her aviation fuel and remaining ordnance feeding fires that made damage control impossible. Admiral Yamaguchi, accepting responsibility for the disaster that had befallen the Japanese fleet, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of survival. As night fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the balance of naval power had shifted irrevocably. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sinking or had already slipped beneath the waves, taking with them over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen, including some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The United States had lost Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine while attempting to tow the crippled carrier to safety. But the American fleet remained intact and capable of further operations. Admiral Yamamoto, learning of the disaster from his position hundreds of miles away with the main battle fleet, made the agonizing decision to cancel Operation MI and withdraw his forces. The invasion of Midway was abandoned, and with it, Japan's hopes of forcing a decisive battle that would drive America from the Pacific. Instead, the Imperial Navy had suffered its first major defeat, losing irreplaceable carriers and aircrew that could never be replaced. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific and the beginning of America's long drive toward victory. Japan's advantage, built through years of preparation and maintained through 6 months of stunning victories, had indeed ended in the waters off Midway, destroyed in a few crucial hours by American courage, intelligence, and the kind of luck that sometimes decides the fate of nations. The rising sun was setting over the Pacific, and America's march toward Tokyo had begun.